Imagine opening a forgotten chest in a silent imperial archive, the wood cracking softly as centuries of dust lift into the air, only to find a single letter sealed with the dying breath of an emperor, a message he never intended the world to read, a confession or a warning. And as you unfold it, you feel something impossible, like history shifting beneath your fingertips, reshaping everything you thought you knew. For centuries, historians have pieced together the rise and collapse of empires through battles, treaties, and monuments, but every so often a single human voice, captured in ink, forces us to reconsider everything. The story of the emperor's final letter begins not with power, but with fear quietly spreading to the grand marble corridors of his palace. He was a ruler known for his iron will. Yet in the last months of his life, something had changed in him. Court officials whispered that he had stopped sleeping, wandering the halls at night as though searching for something or someone who refused to appear. Royal physicians insisted he was merely exhausted, but those closest to him said they had never seen a man so terrified of his own thoughts. And this unease wasn't just personal. The empire itself was trembling. Provinces were revolting. Allies were turning suspiciously silent, and famine had begun creeping across the borders. The scent of collapse lingered in every council chamber. Still, no one understood why the emperor had withdrawn so suddenly from public life, spending his days locked inside his private study, surrounded by scrolls, relics, and maps marked with symbols even the generals didn't recognize. The letter, the very one you and I are about to explore, was written during those shadowed final weeks. Some historians believe it was meant for his successor. Others think it was never meant to be open at all. What makes it extraordinary is not the imperial seal, nor the fragile parchment, but the words themselves, words that reveal the truth the emperor carried alone for decades. A truth that, if released earlier, might have saved countless lives or destroyed the empire even faster. It remained hidden until a young archivist stumbled upon it nearly 300 years later, buried under layers of war logs and tax records. And when scholars finally read it, they realized it was more than a farewell. It was a confession that reached across time to challenge the very foundation of the empire he once ruled. Before we enter the main story, it's important to understand that this letter was written by a man who had seen the world from its highest throne, yet died feeling more powerless than ever. And what he wrote in his final moments will become one of history's most unsettling mysteries. One that forces us to ask, what truth could frighten an emperor more than an invading army? Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy dark history stories like this, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share your feedback in the comments. The emperor began his final letter with a confession so heavy that even the most seasoned historians felt a chill while reading it. For he wrote that power had never frightened him, but the truth always had, and in the last years of his rule that truth had grown into a shadow larger than the empire itself, a presence that followed him everywhere, whispering to him, in every silent corridor, haunting every decision he made, pressing on him with a weight he could neither escape nor share. He described, in trembling detail, the night he first realized that everything he had built stood on foundations ready to crack, a night when he stepped onto his balcony and saw the capital not as a majestic beacon of his authority, but as a breathing, suffering thing trying desperately to survive under pressure of lives buried long before his birth. Lanterns swayed in narrow alleys, smoke curled from distant chimneys, and the once constant hum of bustling life had dimmed into an uneasy stillness that reminded him of a battlefield waiting for the first arrow to be fired. He admitted he felt like an outsider in his own city, a ruler who no longer recognized the world over which he supposedly held absolute control. Then, as he continued, he revealed a moment that set everything in motion. When guards dragged an old mystic into the throne room, a man accused of spreading forbidden prophecies among the common people. The emperor, irritated yet curious, ordered the mystic to speak, expecting the usual ramblings of a desperate soul trying to escape punishment. But instead the mystic stared into his eyes with unnerving calm and told him that the empire would not fall to war, disease, or rebellion, but to truth so deeply hidden that even the emperor himself did not fully understand it. He wrote how he laughed publicly, calling the prophecy nonsense, yet in private he felt something sharp twist inside his chest, as if a locked door had been cracked open by force. He replayed the mystic's words repeatedly that night, unable to sleep, pacing through his chamber while torches flickered and stretched his shadow across the floor like a dark, twisted omen. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the prophecy began to take root in his mind, shaping his fears, guiding his suspicions, altering his judgment in ways he tried desperately to conceal. The more he tried to dismiss it, the louder it echoed through the palace halls, as if the truth itself was stalking him. Then, one evening, a breathless messenger arrived from a distant province bearing news that echoed the prophecy's warning. Local leaders had declared the emperor unfit to rule, claiming that he was protecting a secret that, if revealed, would shatter the empire's identity. The emperor wrote that he felt the blood drain from his face when he heard those words, for he realized that the secret, one he had barely begun to understand, was no longer confined to dusty archives or restricted chambers. It was spreading, and no matter how loyal his soldiers were or how disciplined his ministers pretended to be, truth moved in ways no army could stop. He described locking himself in his private study for days, surrounded by ancient scrolls and forbidden texts left untouched for generations. He recalled how his hands trembled as he unsealed old records marked with warnings, records containing the empire's earliest history, written not by scholars but by witnesses to events now erased from official memory. He wrote of reading until his eyes burned, searching for clarity, yet finding only darker revelations. That the empire's founders had committed atrocities disguised as victories, that entire tribes had been erased and renamed to hide the shame of what truly happened, that the sacred symbols etched into palace walls were not marks of divine blessing, but reminders of pacts forged in desperation and fear. With every discovery, he felt his soul unraveling. He realized he was ruling a realm built not on honor but on rewritten stories, stories polished into polished myths to ensure obedience. As he learned more, he struggled to maintain the image of a confident ruler, while inside, he felt as though he were standing on a frozen lake, hearing the cracks form beneath each careful step. He described sitting in council meetings, nodding to advisors, giving orders to generals, all while feeling like an actor performing a role in a play whose ending had already been written centuries before. He admitted he no longer trusted anyone, neither ministers nor family nor guards, and spent long nights wandering the palace alone, imagining that shadows were watching him. Then came the moment that solidified his fear. The mystic whom he had imprisoned began predicting events the emperor had not disclosed to anyone. A failed harvest, a brewing rebellion, a betrayal within the palace walls. Each prediction unfolded exactly as the mystic foretold, and the emperor wrote that he began to suspect the man knew the truth not through magic, but through knowledge passed down by those who had witnessed the empire's darkest birth. Terrified, the emperor summoned him again, this time not as a ruler demanding obedience, but as a desperate man begging for guidance. And the mystic spoke gently, telling him that the truth would surface whether he confronted it or not, and that lies, no matter how deeply buried, eventually claw their way to the surface. The emperor wrote that he dismissed him once more, but inside he broke completely. He confessed that he became a ghost in his own palace, haunted by voices from the past, voices reminding him that silence was no longer safety but doom. And as he wrote the final lines of this section, he addressed future generations directly, urging them to understand that secrets, when left untouched, grow into monsters that devour everything, including the hearts of kings. The emperor continued his letter by describing the months that followed his terrifying discoveries, months in which he felt the empire tightening around him like a noose woven from centuries of suppressed truth, and he wrote that the weight of what he had found became heavier with every sunset, pressing against his ribs until even breathing felt like a betrayal to the millions who believed the myths that held their world together. Myths he now knew had been crafted with precision to keep people obedient, hopeful, and blind. He described how he tried to function as a ruler during this period, attending court ceremonies, inspecting armies, signing decrees, and smiling at foreign envoys. But internally, he felt as though he were walking across a rotting bridge suspended over a void, every plank creaking with a threat of collapse. He wrote that the ministers closest to him began noticing subtle changes in his behavior. His sudden moments of silence during council meetings, the way his gaze drifted toward the palace windows, as if expecting something ominous, and his habit of clutching his chest whenever a messenger approached with urgent news. He mentioned one advisor in particular, a loyal statesman who had served 3 generations of emperors, who repeatedly asked him whether he was ill or frightened, and the emperor admitted in a letter that he often wished he could confess everything to the old man, but fear silenced him every time, convincing him that the truth would destroy not only the empire but anyone who heard it. As weeks passed, revolts in the outer provinces grew bolder, and rumors spread that the emperor had lost a divine mandate that once justified his rule. He wrote that he began receiving anonymous scrolls left secretly in his chambers, scrolls containing accusations that he had discovered forbidden knowledge, accusations that eerily matched the prophecy spoken by the mystic. He burned the scrolls, but their words settled in his mind like poison. The emperor wrote that at night he dreamed of the empire crumbling, dreamed of palaces sinking into dust, dreamed of legions throwing down their weapons, and dreamed of common people shouting truths he had buried. Every morning he woke drenched in sweat, his pulse racing, and he began wandering the palace halls like a restless spirit. It was during one of these sleepless nights, he wrote, that he stumbled upon a section of the palace archives sealed with iron locks, locks he had never noticed in all his years of ruling. He demanded the keys from the archivist, who trembled as they explained that the chamber had not been opened since the reign of his great-grandfather, sealed after a purge of scholars accused of treasonous research. The emperor felt his throat tighten as the locks clicked open, and the smell of age and dust drifted into the hallway, like a long-buried memory awakening. Inside, he found scrolls, journals, relics, and maps depicting a history completely different from the one carved into monuments and taught in imperial academies. He wrote of finding confessions from generals who admitted to slaughtering entire families under orders later rewritten as heroic victories, letters from early rulers describing alliances forged through deceit, and testimonies from enslaved people whose suffering had been erased from official records. The emperor confessed that reading these documents shattered the last remnants of the faith he had placed in his ancestors. He wrote that he collapsed onto the cold stone floor in that hidden archive and remained there for hours, unable to decide whether he hated the founders for lying or hated himself for upholding their myths. When he finally rose, he felt as though every step he took was guided by ghosts of the past, ghosts demanding justice he could not give. He admitted that his fear turned into paranoia as he wondered how many people before him had discovered pieces of the truth, how many had been silenced, how many had been erased. He described how he began noticing subtle hostility among palace officials, whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, coded glances exchanged between advisors, and a sudden increase in reports of unrest. He wrote that he felt as though invisible hands were tightening around his rule, and he suspected that factions within the palace had begun plotting to replace it with a successor who would reinforce the comforting lies rather than confront the monstrous truth. The emperor claimed in his letter that even his family began treating him differently, as though they sensed he carried a burden that might contaminate them. He wrote of one haunting moment when his young daughter asked him why he looked sad all the time, and he realized he no longer remembered the last time he smiled without forcing it. He tried to shield his family from the truth, but the more he hid, the more distant he became, eventually isolating himself completely in his private chambers. He described spending endless nights studying ancient documents by candlelight, searching for a way to tell the truth without destroying the empire. Yet every possibility only led to more suffering. If he revealed the truth, chaos would consume the land. If he remained silent, corruption would spread like disease. He wrote that the dilemma tore at him daily, ripping his conscience apart until he could barely function. Then he recounted one of the darkest nights of his life, when a group of mass intruders infiltrated the palace and attempted to steal the forbidden scrolls from the hidden archive. He awoke to screams and clashing steel, and when his guards finally secured the palace, they found several intruders dead and a portion of the archives burned. The emperor described standing in the smoky ruins, staring at the ashes of history, realizing that a powerful faction was trying to erase evidence of the truth while he struggled with the guilt of preserving it. He wrote that this moment convinced him the empire was already fractured beyond repair. He admitted that he stopped trusting his generals after the attack, suspecting that some of them were involved. He wrote that he began fearing assassination, imagining that every cup of wine carried poison, and every footstep in the corridor belonged to a traitor. His mind deteriorated under the pressure. Yet he forced himself to continue reading the remaining documents, determined to understand the full truth even if it destroyed him. He confessed that he envied ordinary people who could live without knowing the horrors hidden in their nation's foundation, people who could sleep peacefully, unaware of the blood that paved their streets. As he wrote these lines, Historians noted how his handwriting grew uneven, as though he were battling exhaustion and despair. Near the end of this paragraph, he addressed the reader directly again, warning that truth, once uncovered, demands a price, and that his greatest mistake was believing he could carry it alone. He wrote that he had become both prisoner and guardian of a secret capable of rewriting his civilization's destiny, and he feared that the world would never forgive him for discovering it too late. The emperor's final letter plunged deeper into the unraveling of both his mind and the empire itself, as he wrote the months that followed the attack on the hidden archives, months where sleepless nights became endless cycles of dread, and each sunrise brought news of rebellion, famine, or betrayal. He described the city's streets as if they were alive, breathing with quiet resentment, filled with citizens who sensed, even without understanding, that the world they had believed in was crumbling from within. The emperor confessed that he began walking the halls at night, past empty courtyards and silent fountains, listening for whispers of loyalty that no longer existed, sensing betrayal in the faintest shadow, and feeling as though the very walls were conspiring against him. He wrote of an advisor who had served his family for generations, a man he once trusted implicitly, who approached him under the pretense of counsel, but who, the emperor realized too late, was gathering information to manipulate the succession, feeding lies to both generals and provincial governors to destabilize the throne. He detailed how paranoia consumed every interaction, a smile misread as mockery, a gesture interpreted as conspiracy, and every report doubted, every loyal pledge questioned, until he felt as though he were the last conscious mind in an empire's shadows. The emperor admitted he began keeping multiple diaries simultaneously, some for public record, some for private confession, and some for documents so sensitive that even his closest ministers were unaware of their existence. He explained that these writings were not intended for posterity, but for himself alone, a desperate attempt to maintain some control over events that had long escaped his grasp. And yet in these writings he discovered the faintest threads of hope, records of citizens who defied oppression, scribes who recorded truth despite danger, and rebels who challenged the narrative imposed by those long dead. These glimpses of courage inspired a conflicting sense of duty and despair, for he realized that while human resilience could endure oppression, no single man could bear the burden of centuries of hidden atrocities. He recounted a confrontation with a trusted general who had returned from the northern provinces with alarming reports, villages burned under the pretext of quelling rebellion, leaders executed under false accusations, and yet the public record praised these actions as heroic victories, erasing any acknowledgement of suffering. The emperor admitted that witnessing this deliberate erasure confirmed what he feared most. The empire had been built on lies, and he had been complicit in maintaining them. He wrote of nights when he wept alone in his chambers, unable to reconcile the grandeur of his palace with the cruelty embedded in its foundations, and days when he feigned confidence in council meetings, offering decrees that placated the masses while secretly struggling with moral collapse. He described the loneliness of power, the isolation imposed not by enemies but by the very knowledge he carried, and how the burden of truth transformed even familiar faces into potential threats. In one chilling passage, he recounted discovering coded letters sent between nobles in distant provinces, letters detailing plots to seize the throne once his death was announced, plots that relied on manipulating the very historical lies he had unearthed. The emperor confessed that fear had stripped him of both sleep and appetite, leaving him weak yet alert, each heartbeat echoing the sense that any misstep could hasten the empire's collapse. He described turning to the mystic one final time, not in anger or skepticism, but in desperate need for guidance, and how the mystic's calm, unwavering gaze reinforced what the emperor already knew. The truth could not be contained, and any attempt to shield the empire from it was ultimately doomed. He wrote of witnessing small revolts in the outer provinces that, though seemingly insignificant, were part of a wave of unrest fueled by the cracks in the narrative he had upheld. He described the first time he noticed soldiers refusing orders that conflicted with their own knowledge of the empire's dark history, and the creeping fear that loyalty itself had been corrupted by awareness of the truth. He confessed that he felt powerless in a way he had never known, that for the first time in his life he envied ordinary people whose lives remained untouched by the burden of knowledge. He detailed the final weeks of his life as a descent into obsessive record-keeping, secret meetings, and clandestine investigations, driven by the understanding that no amount of authority could rewrite history or protect him from its consequences. He acknowledged that paranoia had become a companion, guiding him to anticipate every potential betrayal, while simultaneously isolating him from those he once trusted. He described how he attempted to craft a series of letters, messages intended to explain the truth to his successor, hoping to prepare the next ruler for the revelation that would inevitably emerge. Yet every version seemed inadequate, each failing to capture the weight of centuries of deception. The emperor confessed that in these writings, he also left coded instructions for safeguarding documents and artifacts that contained the unvarnished history of the empire, knowing that some might survive even if he did not. He wrote of moments when he considered abandoning the throne entirely, fleeing into anonymity, or destroying all evidence of the empire's dark secrets, yet he realized that neither option would prevent chaos or absolve him of complicity. His penultimate entry is described a night when he walked alone through the palace gardens, gazing at statues that had once symbolized greatness, now transformed his eyes into reminders of human folly, arrogance, and moral compromise. He reflected on the countless lives lost to maintain illusions, the innocent sacrifice to preserve authority, and the intricate web of lies spun to sustain an empire built on deception. The emperor admitted that he had come to fear his own legacy, not for its glory, but for the weight of truth hidden beneath every monument, every edict, and every recorded victory. He recounted one final confrontation with the mystic, during which he begged for guidance on whether to reveal the hidden history or allow the empire to collapse silently under the weight of its secrets. The mystic replied with unwavering certainty that truth, once known, cannot be undone, and that silence may delay catastrophe, but will never prevent it. The emperor wrote that he took these words to heart, realizing that it had only a finite time to act, that every decision he delayed increased the likelihood of violent upheaval. He described how he meticulously drafted his final letter, choosing every word to convey both warning and confession, balancing his own despair with the hope that future rulers, scholars, or even ordinary citizens might learn from his failure. He admitted to trembling as he sealed the letter, aware that in doing so he placed both his name and the empire's fate into the hands of forces beyond his control. In his final lines, he addressed the reader directly, warning that knowledge without courage becomes a prison, that silence allows lies to fester into monsters, and that those who inherit power must confront both history and truth to prevent repeating the mistakes of the past. He urged vigilance, moral clarity, and the acknowledgement that the weight of hidden truths can crush even the strongest of leaders. And with that, he concluded the letter, leaving behind a document that centuries later would challenge historians, provoke moral reflection, and reveal that even the most powerful ruler could be rendered powerless by the inescapable consequences of truth. Reading the emperor's final letter is like peering into a soul trapped between duty and truth, a mind haunted by the weight of history itself. He was a man who had commanded armies, ruled vast lands, and held the loyalty of thousands. Yet in the end, he was powerless before the consequences of silence and the corrosive effect of buried secrets. His confession reminds us that the most devastating forces are not always external. Empires crumble not just from invasion or rebellion, but from the lies that sustain them, from the truths we refuse to confront until they can no longer be contained. As we reflect on his words centuries later, we see striking parallels in our own lives. In the private fears we hide, the truths we avoid, and the moments when a single revelation could alter the course of everything we hold dear. The emperor's story is both a historical account and a timeless cautionary tale, urging us to examine our own decisions, the stories we tell ourselves, and the courage it takes to face reality even when it frightens us. Yet amid the despair, there is a lesson of resilience. Even in his final days, the emperor sought to prepare a future where knowledge might prevent repetition of past mistakes, leaving behind a document that challenges us to think critically, question authority, and value transparency over comfort. History is not merely a record of what has happened, but a guide to understanding the delicate balance between power and responsibility. The emperor's letter forces us to confront the unsettling truth that every action, every omission, and every secret carries consequences far beyond what we can foresee. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon, like the video, and tell us in the comments what type of stories you'd like to see. Where are you watching from right now? And how does this account of fear, power, and hidden truth resonate with you? The emperor's final letter may have been written centuries ago, but its warning echoes still. Courage, honesty, and vigilance are as vital today as they were for the ruler who dared to record the world as it really was.